Before I started, I just thought I'd give you kind of a run-up to where this piece comes. I don't know if any of you have seen the score for Voyage in a White Building. For those of you that have, you know it's intensely graphically notated, and I don't intend to talk about it today except just to mention that I was presented with a particular problem, and here's the problem. I knew 5 composers, 3 of them really, really good composers at Yale, and so I had to write this piece that included them because their participation was really integral in the outcome of the product. A good deal of it's kind of improvised, but with specific demands made upon them where they do the improvisations, for example. 2 of the musicians, one of them was my roommate, his name was Bruce Hansen, and at the time I left the conservatory, and while I was working on this piece, it's a miracle this piece got written at all, Voyage. And we gave a concert in the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. One of the composers, the one who sang the solo speakers part, Lutero, sang recently, had a retrospective of his music, and so he got a bunch of us freaks together, and we all stayed in his father's and mother-in-law's house. I slept in the closet, as I remember, and so I'm claustrophobic. To make it kind of peaceful for me, they put in one of those like Bambi lanterns that spins around with the light on the inside. I don't know if you've ever seen those. Well, you would have been very small if you had seen. So it turned out to be a very nice experience for me. And the piece, if you can call it such, everybody wrote a part of it. And, you know, Humphrey, of course, had created his own sort of, solo pieces, and he had his own format in which he put it. And the idea was that each of us realized some part of it, and some parts of it never were performed at the Smithsonian Institute. The concert opened, I was on stage, sitting down, writing my impressions of the audience as they came in on a roll of toilet paper. And as I was doing this with some bemusement, a music critic walked in who used to be the music critic for the San Diego Union. He was really bright, really smart. He thought that I and the rest of my trio, we had a string trio in those days, were just the bee's knees and could do no wrong. I had a lot of pieces played by San Diego Symphony, also by professionally and orchestras and some not so professional. And then the radio station did a broadcast of my music with interviews and KOGO radio station. Then I went to the conservatory, and life changed considerably for me, I must say. And I left after the first year. And I came back knowing that what I really wanted to be was a composer rather than a cellist. And I was a good cellist. But one of my friends, violinist friend called Paul Sievertson, I've been playing with since junior high school. We're still friends today. And he's still an ace fiddle player. And he was in the group as well. So when Voyage got written, my violinist friend, well, he didn't have any time to rehearse. So I had to write something that sounded really terrific for the fiddle that he wouldn't have to practice. So I used a piece I was writing at the same time called Phaedra Antimenes for solo violin. And the big solos for violin in Voyage in a White Building that are from Phaedra Antimenes. And at one point I took the solo violin piece, piled the whole section of it together, and stacked it vertically, and had it played by like 10 solo violins. Um, and it's one of the more interesting points in the piece. I solved that problem, but the sitar player was, I don't know if you know the name, Stephen Moscow, composer, taught at Cal Arts. Not a name much known, but he knew everybody and did everything you're supposed to do academically, taught at Cal Arts. And he was a great mind, just one of the 3 greatest minds I've known as composers, and Humphrey was the 3rd. And Lucky was a drummer. He wasn't a great track drum player or anything like that, but he showed me everything I needed to know. So I wrote all this stuff into this piece. The other problem with writing it is I had an auto harp player who could not read music. He would just kind of, he was my roommate, he was an artist from San Diego, and he would sit out on the 3rd floor walk up to the balcony with this oak tree. Its leaves just kind of covered the balcony. Late at night when it was dark, stars were out, there would be Bruce sitting in the corner of the balcony wildly playing this out-of-tune auto harp. Half the strings were missing, it was out of tune. And it is one of the big solos that Jason had to play. The other thing was, he couldn't read music. So how do you write a piece for people, you know, who are totally literate and people who are musically illiterate? And then there was the matter of the sitar part, which was played by Lucky Moscow's brother, Marty Moscow. He could play the sitar after fashion, but he couldn't read music. So how do you write a piece for those, you know, forces? So I had to invent some kind of system that could do both, be played by it, so it became a totally visual piece. And I had to write visual elements that I could communicate on impact. When you looked at them, you knew where you were in the page, but you also knew kind of what you were supposed to do. I was very light on specifics. My procedure for that piece, I followed all my life basically, is I meet with every musician individually if I'm going to write a piece. And we talk about, you know, well, what can you do? I ask them questions, can you do this, can you do that? They, I can't do that. Well, try. See, you can do it. And then they show me things that they like to do, or, you know, and those things I always incorporate into pieces. So, in fact, what I have been in the process of doing most of my creative life is when I'm writing for people I know, is I write their personalities and their gestures into the piece itself. And because of the way things are written, both in this piece and the other piece, if I make a mistake, the mistake becomes a part of the piece. Performance-wise, I sometimes hear mistakes that I really, really like, and I put it back into what makes the changes in the score, because sometimes people do things inadvertently. You say, wow, why didn't I think of that? I totally fucked up. But it gives the pieces a kind of spontaneity, a life. My concept is not that music should be a dead thing. So my idea, there was Bedrough, written at the same time but premiered a year earlier than Virgin and White Building. Virgin and White Building was finished in '69. We did a performance at Yale, which is terrific. We did a performance then in Jordan Hall, which was the reason why I put the score under my bed and didn't look at it for 40 years. Until Jason called me and I said, why that piece? Of all the pieces I've written, why that one? And I've since been, it's not that I thought it was a bad piece, please don't understand that part. It was the performing experience was so, just so negative, because it should have been much more than it was. And I just kind of didn't feel it happened. Good things did happen in it. And so I was a little surprised when I took that out from underneath my bed and looked at it. But after that, I wrote a symphony, my Symphony Nosferatu. I don't know if this is in the library.
It is. It's the one score of yours that was in the
It's
library.
probably the only thing of
before.
mine that's in the library.
Yeah.
Obviously never performed, but this was written for one of our other composition students, Tibor Putztai, who was becoming a conductor. He's this crazy Hungarian guy. He teaches at Berkeley now, to conduct. And Gunther Schuller was, you know, sort of our president at the time. Things appeared like this was going to happen. So I unleashed everything I knew from writing Voyage in a White Building, along with almost perfect notation. I developed a system that combined very specific live events within graphic notation. So the piece kind of goes in and out of the two. Now, it was during the war in Vietnam. A lot of things were happening. One day, my roommate and I sat down to eat breakfast, and the night before, tear gas rose in a big smoke and filled the sky all over Yale. It was like a wall of you know, this horrible smoke. Well, we survived that, and we sat down to have breakfast the next morning, you know. And as we were sitting down to eat our toast and eggs and have coffee, there were National Guard tanks going by our front window, and we're watching them go by in somewhat a state of disbelief. And we opened up the windows, and as we heard, there was this chant of women coming down Whaley Avenue, which is one of the main streets that goes into York Square, which is where Yale kind of meets the city, so to speak. And we heard this chant, "Fuck Harvard, fuck Yale, get our sisters out of jail." This was just coming, you know, and they kept getting louder and louder and louder. I said, gee, this is something I haven't heard in New Haven. Tanks in the street, you know. Well, I was working on this. I started working on this piece at the time. And if you put yourself with me in that room, it was a very large white room, built in the 20s. All the walls were painted white. Beautiful parquet wooden floor. Casement windows that faced the street with a lot of light, lace curtains that you could see through, with prisms suspended by fishing tackle in the windows, like a whole, like hundreds of prisms. And over in one corner was this immense Empire mirror that I took up from a house on St. Vital Street, one of the brownstones. They left all the furniture in it because it was so big and heavy nobody could move it. Well, I managed to take a mirror that was about this big, and that was on one side of the room. The room was filled with plants around, including bamboo trees, everything I had grown. It was like a forest. And the kitchen, we moved the kitchen table to overlook the funeral parlor next door. That's where we had our meals. To give you a kind of balance to things. And the wonderful thing was, if you walked in that room and the sun was shining, the prisms would spin. And my roommate loved to, like, you know, give them a turn and let them spin. And across this white wall, you would get this absolute blazing shaft of violet light, so pure, so intense on the white wall. It would just come up from the prism and go. And then it would turn this beautiful blue or red or intense yellow. And one of the pieces I wrote, one of the miracles, is that it's a fragment, group of fragments that go together to form what is the second movement of this piece. I can give you scores, but you know, I don't think it really makes all that much difference. I can't play an excerpt from it. Not really crucial, but pass that around. What I was trying to get at was some kind of ostinato motive, which occurs high in the prepared piano, with these kind of double stop harmonics in the cello and the alto flute playing these other low tones. And the piece starts out, everything is kind of staggered. There's a certain sort of, there's this light, and then there'll be this kind of little event, and then the ostinato will come back to the spinning of the prism, and then another little shaft of light. And I composed this directly into the music. And it was to try to grab hold of something that was fleeting, how to put that into notation. A magical moment that was here and gone in a second, but how do you get it down on paper? And by this time I decided, when I wrote this piece, I wasn't writing for, well, specifically I wasn't really writing for someone at this point, and I decided that it was time for me to take everything I'd learned and just really, really try and focus myself on taking musical gestures, which I found very easy to do with gesture notation, and put it into fully notated form. And this piece is a result of that, because I always tried to write something, if it was graphically notated or semi-graphically notated, or if I mixed them, the next piece I wrote, I tried to do mostly notated. And this piece is probably remarkable, I think, because I was able to work on a very large scale. And that was hard. When you think about my story about the, fuck Harvard, fuck Yale, get our sisters out of jail, that was a new one to me at the time, but there was a lot of anger in the air at that time. We did not trust our government. Our phones were tapped. We were repeatedly busted by the police who, tapped our phone. It wasn't paranoia. You might think it was. I mean, I even thought it was until we found out years later there was a class action suit against the city of New Haven for indeed serially tapping everybody's phones. So when you're in a society in which you feel that the government on every level is totally against you, you have to do something. My friends, some of them, went in for demonstrations. I wasn't that kind of person. I had some experiences in San Diego. A friend of mine got her picture in the paper, and it kind of made me very leery. But I decided that if the world was going to go crazy around me, the only way to survive it was through fantasy. That's why it's called the Fantasy Manual for Urban Survival. And as a result of that, I decided on a very large-scale form. All my pieces, my symphony is about an hour or something long. It's never been played. It'll never be played, so I'm not terribly hopeful about that. But this is written, I started off writing this because a cellist friend of mine from master classes, we were quite young when we were in master classes, cello master classes in University in San Diego, and we were good, and he was a really good cellist, and he decided, this is because we had a draft at that time, you don't have that problem, thank God, but they were drafting us, and they tried to draft me and my brother, and they were going to draft my friend Douglas, the cellist, for whom this piece is originally written. So he moved off to Malmö, Sweden, and became the principal cellist of the Malmö Swedish Orchestra, and he had a chamber music group. And it was for the Swedish female flutist, him and a pianist. And I thought, he asked me would I write a piece. Well, he knew my more conservative pieces, which were tonal from San Diego days, and write a piece for flute, cello, and piano. Doesn't sound like me. So I started work, and I wrote a piece, 2 movements. I decided, I was reading Sir Francis, I was reading Tovey's essays at the time, and he, you know, sort of uptight British, but very knowledgeable guy. And one observation really struck me. He said, composers today do not know how to write fast music. And that kind of hit a chord with me. I started thinking about Barbara Daggio, you know, the really beautiful, lush things that were rewritten and were popular at the time. But I couldn't think of a whole lot of really good fast movements of the music that was written in the 30s, 40s, and early 50s. So I started feverishly writing. I don't know what the hell I was thinking, but, you know, 30-second notes, and I was writing these difficult figures. I was using whole tone and chromatic scales and combining them. Anyway, I finished 2 movements, and I sent it off to them to Malmö, Sweden, and I got a letter back saying, too many notes. I'm always suspicious of somebody who writes this many notes. And he was right. And I realized what I'd written was not worth the paper. I wasted writing it down. So I took it, I ripped it up, and I threw it away. I said, okay, I'm going to write a piece. Only this piece is going to be my piece. And I decided, instead of using flute, I wanted the color, or what I imagined the color of the alto flute to be. You'll find an alto flute part in Voyage in a White Building, but you know, the alto flutist asked for these god-awful noises in the instrument, so I never really got to hear what the instrument sounded like, right? So all I had to go by was the gorgeous alto flute solo from Daphnis and Chloe. I mean, that was it. That's all I had to go on, what the instrument really sounded like, or could sound like. So I imagined the whole thing. The cello part was, I'd stopped playing the cello, and I decided, okay, I'm going to write something that I couldn't play. And I'm going to write it without regard to whether or not I'm constricted by my own abilities to play a particular cello part. I did succeed, did I not, Bobby, in writing something that was just fucking hard to play. I mean,
the cello part.
The cello part.
Well, all the flute parts are so easy.
No, it isn't.
I mean,
it wasn't.
The cello part is very difficult.
It's very, very difficult.
You feel lucky you don't have to play yourself.
Very. But I had the freedom for the first time in my life to do that, and I hadn't really had this before. I had some kind of stability. My roommate and I had been in a 43-year-long relationship, and I had the time to do that. Now, I also worked at a pornography bookstore. We sold Shakespeare and you know, softcore porn. And that was, you know, I had to earn some money. The rest of the time I would come home from that job and work on my piece. And none of my pieces come easily. It takes a very, very long time. But once I get there, where I'm into it, you can't stop me. I write everything you see on the page, including all the staffs, that's all done by hand. Everything is done by hand, by which I mean rapidographs, which thank God you don't have to use anymore. But in this score, I was just lucky enough to, I think, really capture what the music had to look like. The music would sound. The printed page has to look as it would sound. And JP once mentioned this. Somebody said, "Oh, this piece should, you know, make a project out of this piece. You should recopy it," and that just struck a chord. No, no, dude, I'm so proud of this score. Please, Don't recopy it. It says exactly. Yeah, I'm still finding typographical errors and, still making small adjustments all these years later. Hey, that's part of the process. What I basically did is I took what are called Schwangesang because I had 2 semesters. This was after I graduated, but before I graduated, I had 2 semesters with Ernst Oster, who taught Schenkerian analysis of Schubert Lieder. I mean, go figure, come on. I mean, the guy was 1930s schooled, educated, so he was around the time of Schenker. That's how he thought. But the guy would sit down at the piano and play this stuff, and it was all singers other than me. And it was a revelation to hear all this Gothic, early Gothic romanticism. Sometimes in Schubert's Lieders, they are so short, it's like Weber. In its economy of means, its lack of a whole bunch of notes, except when he was doing that wrestling thing that we all love Schubert for doing, which is a lot of notes. But in the songs, he keeps everything down to very, very narrow parameters. And he's able to create these whole worlds within each of his songs. I grew up hearing these songs, so it made a tremendous impression on me. One of the things Ernst taught us, and believe me, I paid no attention to the Schenkerian analysis of it. I'm not a Schenkerian guy. I think he misses an awful lot. If it's heresy I'm speaking, I've heard that, right? But what he did teach me is how to set text to music. Specifically how Schubert did. He would talk about Brahms, he would talk a little bit about Schumann, and sometimes we would look at Chopin just for the piano writing, where we felt like it. But that idea of syllabic, the syllabic content of a poem being represented by a certain succession of notes in a specific rhythm, that was a revelation to me. Plus the sort of Gothic darkness, I found that very appealing. And so what I did is I wrote what I call 3 Schwangesang, because some of my favorite pieces are Schubert's Schwangesang. They're incredible works. And it's pretty dark. And I kind of was at that point, but I was a young man, full of energy. And I took that and combined it with my love of Weber. And I put the 2 together, and I wrote the first Schwangesang. After I'd done that, I was gonna invert it, and then I was gonna play retrograde inversion. I was gonna go, all those procedures. And I realized, as I was doing this, hey, a simple variation works perfectly. If you take all the stuff that starts at the beginning and you have a much simpler thing, that can go in the middle of a piece as a kind of structural pillar, and then come back in the very ending, maybe in a retrograde form, which is exactly what happens in this piece. The cello part is asked in the very end to play up to the highest F on the piano. This one. Pianissimo, sostenuto. I mean, if that won't tax your ability to perform as a player, nothing will. I had the courage to do that because I played a piece of Herman Weiss's, one of his string quartets, when we were students. And in Herman's string quartet, he wrote this really savagely hard cello part, and it was like way up in the stratosphere, and there was no fudging the notes. I had to play those pitches exactly in tune, and I thought, thank God I don't have to do that. So I'm going to invest him. I'm going to write a high F. And so that last movement, the cello goes from the high F down to the low C string. I mean, it's the whole compass of the instrument. So I have these And that was in more or less pretty retrograde form. I decided, one thing Bob Kogan said to me that I felt I was answering a lot of questions that Bob asked me with this piece. Two of them are, he taught me a lot about structure as a composer. And not every one of you needs to know that lesson, because some of you, that's not what your problem is, or that's not where your weakest. But for me, I was weakest there. And the thing that really made this piece possible is I did all the pre-composition for the shape of the piece. I decided it was going to be an arc form with the three Schwanengesang, one at the beginning, one it's almost the middle, and one at the end. And I decided it was going to be in 6 movements. And my way of thinking is, I guess generally, in what 6-minute movements. I mean, I seem to kind of, the second movement, the third movement are totally different. One's one of the more peaceful things that I wrote, and one is the most absolutely angry and violent and fierce pieces I've ever written, which is saying a lot because I've written a lot of violent music. But I knew that after that, 6 minutes of these, just capturing these beautiful moments, somehow putting that on paper, in which the musicians can order any way they want to within certain rules. I like to give rules. It's the kind of guy I am, I can't help it. So they have a freedom there. But it's very, those, they're called miracles, but they're really fragments. They're very spacious. There's a lot of silence. It's not dead silence, it's expectant silence. And then I got to the 4th movement, and I knew that I had a poem by Eichendorff, and this poem just spoke to me. And the first part of the poem was about, it was a meditation sitting by a lake, sort of like full with ripe pears, and wild roses. The land hangs into the lake. And there's a whole bit about swans. Well, picture this. I mean, that's a very intense image to me, and that was the first stanza. And I thought to myself, well, what if I had players who can put through every stress test I could manage to think up for them up to this point? What if I had them do Sprechstimme while they played? This was not in the air at the time. People didn't do that. And although it existed in relative isolation, this was new. It won't sound that way perhaps now, but it was fairly revolutionary, as is a good deal of this piece. And in the course of saying that, I thought, how can I represent the land full of yellow pears and Bilden Rosen, the land hangs into the sea, you proud swans, you know, it goes on and on with swans swim. Well, you have a lake, you have the land, you have the reflection of the land, which is reality, reflecting on the surface of the water. Unbroken, it may seem like reality itself. But the swan swimming through it, it starts to break the surface of reality, and you begin to get these ripples in reality. And that is the world in which this poem was written. It's not the land, it's a reflection of reality. So when you come to the second stanza, it says, "O weh mir, wo nehme ich, wenn es Winter ist, die Blumen und die Schatten, die Erde." Now, always very, where do I take, where are the shadows? And it goes on in this sort of deeply disturbed mindset. And it ends the poem with, "Im Winde klirren die Farnen." In the wind, the weather vanes clatter. It's a wonderful image for a freezing, cold, frigid German landscape in which all autumnal beauty is gone, frozen over, this kind of cold, piercing ice everywhere. And so what I did is I started out that movement, and I'm talking longer than I really intended to do. Forgive me for that, but what I started out to do, when you're writing a big piece, does anyone have any suggestions about how to write a big piece? If you're not writing repetitive motion like Philip Glass or those kinds of, that kind of process, where something's unfolding as a result of repetition. You have any ideas? Well, I was faced with that question, and the way I solved it is, I always like to say that this piece is written in the key of the 2-octave harmonic on the cello C string. Do you have it now? Because that piece comes back through the entire piece. You have to have something that's a return point, so that the ear and mind can feel like, well, we've been here. You may not know that you're hearing this again. And my intent was always to make that C sound totally different depending on what I did with the alto flute, coloring it and shading it. Well, that's how I did it. I did it using cello harmonics that reoccur through the piece, certain pitches on the alto flute. The piano part I wrote with reoccurring B naturals, and the bass there are reoccurring chords that come back in different guises. How I specifically set out to write that C using that C natural harmonic with the alto flute in the fourth movement. Well, I don't know if you can see that. Just kind of pass this around. There's one more score there. There's
it's here.
one for the back. If you guys can use this, I took the C natural harmonic from cello C string. It's played arco. You just get this one line, and then the line begins to split off in grace notes and the flute a half a step higher. The piano plays prepared notes that are half a step lower, and you start to get this play. So what I'm doing is taking the line and splitting, and that splitting represents the reality as seen, as reflected in the water. And it is that reality in which the whole movement exists, this kind of fantastical place that moves from very sort of picturesque swan tones to that. I use extended cello techniques, things I've never seen before on the instrument, like trilling on the C string between two natural harmonics. You get the stuff that occurs in between that helps to blur that line that's reality. So I'm starting to work on these levels, and there's also an awful lot of aquatic gestures in this. I was a surfer in San Diego. I mean, I surfed. I was in the ocean an awful lot, and I have a kind of love for things aquatic, and I put that together with my father's natural sense of photography, and he was a San Diego zoo photographer, and I spent a lot of time at the zoo drawing birds, and I knew swans very well, and I combined that with something Robert Hogan said to me. He said, we're talking about Sibelius' fourth. I know. You're probably thinking, oh, this guy's an old foodie. He's talking about Sibelius, but Sibelius is one of my great composers. This man did things that nobody else did in a way that nobody else could. And we were talking about the Fourth Symphony, and I was curious to hear Bob Cogan say, this piece has this amazing tritonal language in it. I said, gee, I never thought of it that way. You know, and I started thinking about it. And he was right. It's one of Sibelius' most extreme works. And then Bob said, you know, you can always tell a really good composer from a really mediocre one by how they use tritones. And Bob said to me the other day when I told him, I said, you know, you tell me a lot of things I really can't remember saying, but that's one thing I can remember saying. With that in mind, I set about to write this movement, and it is filled with tritones. The second movement of the piece is filled with every conceivable kind of tritone, melodic, harmonic, you name it, gestural, their harmonics, their tritones, all through this piece. And it wasn't, you know, I didn't have to prove anything at this point in my life. It's just that sometimes you have to show things to yourself. I can do this. You know, you succeed or you don't succeed. I mean, that's always a danger, I suppose, in being a composer or any kind of musician. But you at least have to have the courage of your convictions. And I know with this piece, even though I can talk about it, I'm not talking about the end, but I think I was incredibly successful at capturing a whole world of sound in what the fast version is 31 minutes. The California, the California Ear Unit did it in 1985. That was the second performance of it, and it took them 36 minutes. They were much more reverent of me as a composer, I think, and they were determined that they would do everything exactly as they thought I had asked them to do. Well, in the meantime, the pianist, who was genius with preparation, did his own preparations. He didn't use the elements that I asked for, and I went to the first rehearsal, and the piece was totally learned. I didn't have to do anything. It was amazing. I mean, how often does that happen to any of you? I mean, if it has happened to you, you know what I mean? Oh, this is heaven. All I had to do was just, you know, okay, a little slower here, a little faster, bring this out here, bring this out here, make this more melodic, you know, let me hear your beautiful cello solo sounds. And what Gaylord Mowry, who was the pianist at the time, did with the preparations, even though they were totally different elements than I asked for, it was perfect. I mean, it was absolutely perfect. The guy was a genius. I don't know how he did it. I tracked him down to Mexico City right before we started this rehearsal for this program. I was going to ask him, how did you do this, Gaylord, 15 years ago? And he wrote me back, and I didn't ask him, and I said, hi, Gaylord. He said, how'd you find me? So I couldn't very well say, do you remember when you prepared my piano piece 15 years ago? Do you remember how you did that? I was to write yet another all my piano parts are prepared. The last piece I did was Night Lines, and I wrote specifically over the telephone with Gaylord. He would do these preparations on the piano. I said, how does this sound for her? And he played over the phone, and I'd be in Florida. And not quite. I said, well, let me try something else. How does this sound? Oh yeah, that's much better on the phone. I mean, you know, for hours. And so this piece, which I did not want to bring along with me, there's only one copy of the score, and I didn't want to lose it. I think it's one of the best pieces I've ever written as well, Night Lines. And it has yet to be performed any other place but 3 times in California. And the last time it was performed with my friend Stephen Lucky Moscow, Lucky as we all called him, conducting. The guy made music come alive. And the guy was a total contemporary music genius. He could take the Carter Double Concerto for a harpsichord and piano. They lost their conductor, and they called him up. Could you conduct the Carter Double with one rehearsal this evening? And he flew into San Francisco, and the guy did the thing from memory. and nobody could believe he could do this. And the clarity of his vision was astonishing. He's another story for some other time, with some other group. But what you find as a composer, I think, the really important thing is that you know people here at the conservatory or in your musical life for whom you may or may not have written music, but for some reason you're close, one way or the other. Because later on, after you finish and you see, I can tell you this, having been there, everybody goes like this, trying to find work, their lives change, they get married, not get married, whatever. Things have a way of moving in ways you don't expect. Hold on to your friends, because I think that's the one thing that is, I can say personally, that has kind of kept me going. I mean, it's amazing that I call him Groton because we all called him Groton because he went to Groton school and none of us ever went to a, we went to junior high school, not a private school, so this great flutist is nicknamed Groton. Don't tell him that. But I've known him all these years. The guy is phenomenal. And he once said, "Burr, how do you know how to write for flute?" And I said, well, when I was a kid, I used to listen to shakuhachi music a lot, being a Pacific Rim person. And I also listened to the Bach flute and harpsichord sonatas. But I said, really how I know how to write for the flute is from living in the dorm around the corner and going into the bathroom, those big communal bathrooms, right? Well, there'd be Robert Sonic, I really shouldn't tell you the story, but I'm going to. It loses its impact otherwise. There would be Groton, a sort of Rubenesque shape, sitting in his BVDs on one of the basins, practicing flute. And this would go on scales and arpeggios for hours. And that's how I know how to write for the flute. And I think there's probably not anything that the flute can't do. When I took my alto flute part, shaking with trepidation, because I was really honestly guessing whether or not this would be what the alto flute would sound like. I took it to Storrs, Connecticut, where Groton was where he lived, and I had him play through it. And within 3 seconds, I knew that I had guessed right. This was exactly the sound that I imagined being played by one of the best flutists. And of course, what he did is, hey, you've written this way. Do a shake here. Yeah, maybe. But what if you did this? And he would show me stuff. I said, okay, I'm going to write that down. And I would write it down. And I go back to my haven and go into the piece. That is sort of the genesis of this piece. If I can impart anything to you as a composer, I've tried to do that in a sort of narrative form. I apologize greatly. It was my hope that I would have enough time to at least sit down with you and look at some of your scores. I'm disappointed in myself for just talking too long, for not making that possible. Best thing I can suggest, get together all and pull your scores out and start playing CDs for each other. It's a really good way of finding out lots of things that you're not going to find out in composition classes. Thank you for being a wonderful audience. I've got to go to rehearsal. Thank you for coming.
And just a reminder, Manual for